Good morning. I just wanted to do a quick video explaining the terms in my songs. So this is the explaining the songs video, which I was promising. Now the first term in the video is my first song, because I'm going to do both, is Tripartite Sequence. Now a lot of people getting confused with this. It seems to be called lots of different things, so you might have heard of it as the rule of three, or the power of three, or the list of three. Now if you're strictly calling it a tripartite sequence, it's probably going to be longer than single words. But if, for example, this is the simplest form of it, you said, my English teacher is handsome, funny, and intelligent, you are using a rule of three, or a power of three. For some reason, when you use three things together, it is quite convincing. It's just more than two, and it shows a little bit of intelligence on your part, or on the part of the writer, depending on whether you're trying to use it yourself in section B or whether you're actually spotting it in section A. One of the dangers with tripartite sequence, or power of three, is to see it everywhere. Do count carefully and make sure there are only three items. Tripartite sequence could be a bit more extended, so it might be three clauses within a sentence with a comma demarcating each one, or even a semicolon demarcating each one. It could be three reasons given straight after each other. If it's not right next to each other, then it's not a sequence, so it could not be called a tripartite. If in doubt, call it a list. So that's tripartite sequence out of the way. The next term in my song is imperative. Sit down, shut up, get on with your work. Those are all imperatives. The word imperative implies it's a little bit bossy. It's a command. If you can't spell the word imperative, use the word command. However, sometimes the imperative can come across as a little bit softer. It can be modified by a please or something like that. Get out your books, please. Listen to your teachers, they'll use imperatives a lot of the time. If teachers said, you might like to write this down, chances are you're not going to. Of course, if they said that, you might like to, then they're using a modal verb, which is another term used. Now, if you're trying to advise someone, or if you're wanting to keep them on your side at the very start of an argument or a speech or an article, then you'll use modal verbs. It could be, it may be said that, and people will have to agree with, well, yes, it could be said that. But by the time you get to the end of your argument, particularly for, say, a question 6, you should have got them on your side enough, hopefully through anecdotes, through facts, through logical reasons, to get away with saying something like, we must all take action now. And when you use that imperative like that, then it creates a sense of emotive urgency, and it makes people want to take action. So imperatives are extremely useful, and if they're taking place in texts, it's well worth noting what they're doing. Don't just say it's an imperative, say what it's doing. A metaphor, his heart was a stone, her eyes were fire. You're saying that one thing is something else. Now, don't fall into the trap that a lot of my Year 11s are, if you're out there listening, are doing at the moment, which is to say, this can't be true, so it's a metaphor. One example, which was rather odd, it was talking about screeching wind, I think, and the student said, naming no names here, shall I name and shame someone? I won't, okay, comment in if you want to find out who it was. But the student said, wind does not make any noise, so this must be a metaphor. Now, firstly, it's not a metaphor, screeching wind, but secondly, wind does make a noise. Where have you been? Maybe, and that student isn't hearing impaired as far as I know. So yeah, when you get a metaphor, don't just waste a whole sentence saying, because this isn't true, it must be a metaphor. What the examiner wants to know is what the effect is of that metaphor. His heart was a stone. In other words, there was no blood going in or out of his heart. He had no feeling anywhere. It didn't mean his literal heart was a stone, because he'd be dead. But it's not worth saying that, to be honest. It's better to say the hardness. A stone is hard. So what qualities does the object have that it's being compared to? And then what qualities relate back? Why has it been used? Why has that particular object been compared? The sun is an orange ball. Why is it being described as an orange ball? Is it emphasising the clarity of the outline of the sun, or the fact that you can see it so clearly that the atmosphere is almost translucent? What is it about? Is it the orange? Is it the kind of glow of it, the sense of life and vitality that we associate with the colour orange? Simile is quite different from a metaphor. It's much more experimental in a sense. It's much easier to spot. You can kind of tell that the writer is trying to use similes. A lot of metaphors are everyday, and you don't notice them if you're not careful. You have to really look hard to notice the everyday metaphors. But a simile is much more literary, and you will spot it a mile off. If you don't spot it, you really ought to be able to. So you could cut the atmosphere with a knife. That's actually quite a common one in everyday use, isn't it? But there are very literary similes, like he ran fast as a speeding bullet. That's a cliche as well, of course, and you want to avoid cliched similes. If you notice that you overuse similes, just use one in a piece of writing. Don't use more than one. One is enough. An examiner will spot one simile. If in doubt and you really love them, use two. But also spot them in section A in the pieces of writing. Next on my list is alliteration. Please, with alliteration, do not identify words unless they are adjacent to each other as alliterating, with weak sounds like w or a, you know, the W's and the A's and the consonants. Really, alliteration, you'd hardly even notice it. But what you're looking for, really, with alliteration, are the plosives, are the sounds that create a real force of air through the mouth, like p, b, k, and f. Those are your plosives. Well, f is a fricative, but it's also got a lot of air coming out of your mouth. So you get words like purple, purple pansies, for example. And if that is in a piece of writing, you'd notice it. You know, cranky characters. Other thing to remember with alliteration is it's the sounds you're looking for, not what it looks like on the page. So cranky characters, if you see it on the page, doesn't look like alliteration because it's CH. However, when you say it, it is, unless you happen to pronounce characters. Like there is the odd person I come across who calls it characters, but most of them don't once they've moved in kind of articulate society for a while. So look for those sounds, particularly the plosive sounds. The other sound, of course, to look out for, which is also very powerful with alliteration, is the S sound, sibilance. And sibilance always creates a sinister, malevolent feel, or it can sometimes create a calming, soothing feel. So look at the text, look at the context, and decide what the effect is for alliteration. Don't forget, alliteration is also absolutely vital in poetry. What you don't want to do is be identifying alliteration everywhere. Sometimes, particularly if you're looking at reported speech or something like that, there won't necessarily be meaning to put alliteration in there, and the effect won't be intended. It will be simply accidental. Don't go over the top with alliteration. Adjectives, underused. Do think about unusual adjectives in your pieces of writing. An adjective, of course, is a describing word, but it doesn't always just go before a noun. So, for example, I got up in the morning, the sun was bright and the birds were cheerful. You could change that round and you could say the bright sun and the cheerful birds. If you can turn it round, if you're just saying the sun was bright, the birds were cheerful, cheerful birds, bright sun, then the words cheerful and bright are both adjectives. A lot of words can become adjectives by going in front of nouns. Do think about slightly unusual adjectives. By the way, going off on one slightly higher level here, a collocation is where you get two words that commonly go together. And this is okay as long as you don't overdo it. So bright sun would be an example of a collocation. Collocation is spelled C-O-L-L-O-C-A-T-I-O-N. All right, and if you spot collocations in a text, you can say that this is a fairly standard text because it's using collocations. But if the text is using some quite shocking and surprising adjectives that you wouldn't have associated with those nouns, then you can say that there are some unusual collocations in the text. Don't forget that source 3 for section A, as I think I said on the previous video, is likely to be more literary, and so will have more unusual adjectives. Do talk about the connotations of those adjectives. You're going to get a higher grade if you can talk about the effect of them. Last one on my first video, we're doing not too bad here, this is slightly longer than I thought it would be, was colloquialism. A colloquialism is something you say in common speech, but you wouldn't necessarily write down if you had time to think about it. So if you said something like, I've got heaps of work to do, for example, you'd throw it off the tongue quite easily. If you wrote it down as a piece of formal writing, just as a kind of report or something, and you came back to it and you were redrafting, you would look at that and think, no, that is that's slangy, that's informal, I need to change that into something more formal. Now, in literary texts or in news articles particularly, writers will use a cunning combination, notice my alliteration there, a cunning combination of formal lexis, formal words, in order to convince you that they're intelligent, they know what they're talking about, specialist words related to the topic they're writing about, and informal language. If you can pick out the colloquialisms in an article from The Guardian, from The Times, from something like that, you will be, and ask yourself, why have they used them? Look at the placing of that colloquialism. Quite frequently they place colloquialisms at the start of an article and kind of in the middle, if it's quite a long article. That's where they'll use a swear word, if they do, and you will find swear words in these articles. Taboo language, which you should refer to, and why have they used it? To shock, to amuse, to laugh, to keep the reader engaged. It might be appropriate, an appropriate taboo word for the topic in question. And then at the end of the article, they might well again possibly come back to colloquialisms or towards the end. And it just warms the reader towards the speaker. These features of spoken language make a writer more down to earth, more human, more likeable. And that's really important. Okay, now move on to the second section. This is simply a description of the two acronyms. Now, an acronym is simply a word or a series of letters, a couple of words, phrase, that stand for different key terms that you want to remember. So if you can remember the acronym, you should be able to remember, this is the idea, most of the words in it. Now, write that acronym down at the top of your paper, write the words down if you need to, tick them off as you go, so that you make sure, particularly for section B, that you use and that you're thinking about the language features that you're using. Professional writers and experienced writers consciously use language techniques. Sometimes they use them unconsciously, when they're just letting something flow and just going with it because they're just habituated to it. In the same way that a driver of a car will not think every time he or she changes gear. They won't think every time they check in their mirrors, but they're still doing it, and they're doing it for a very good reason. And this is the same way. A lot of students say, oh, writers didn't mean to do that. Surely they didn't mean to use a metaphor. They didn't mean to use onomatopoeia. Well, of course they did. Of course they did. Grow up a little bit and realise that just because something is habit does not mean to say that it is not intentional. And some of the writers that you get, particularly the novelists and the poets at in the exam, are, particularly for the literature GCSE, are seasoned writers. This is what they do. That they're no less professional than a brick builder or a plumber who deliberately does that particular thing, who deliberately has that tool, who deliberately does things in that sequence. So, Da Forest, lecture over. Da Forest, I've made it Da Forest rather than A Forest, in honour of Mr. Brough, do check out his videos and his revision guide at 99p on Kindle. Well worth it, I would say, if only for the laughs. Daft Forest stands for, as you should have caught at the end of my song, direct address, alliteration, fact, opinion, rhetorical questions, emotive words, statistics, and tripartite sequence, although I've been saying to my class rule of 3, but I thought we might as well keep it consistent if we can. Okay, and then MASSIVE, the other acronym. Now, it's up to you whether you use this or not. Mr. Bruff recommends that you use Daft Forest for question 5 and 6. And at this stage, you might well think, yeah, I can only really remember one acronym. But if you want to try and remember MASSIVE, the benefit of it for question 5 is if you're writing to describe. They may not ask you to write to describe, but if they do, wheel out MASSIVE if you can. So MASSIVE stands for metaphor, alliteration, senses, simile, and then the I is interesting, but it has to link up with the V, which is verbs, interesting verbs. Now the E, my version of it is engage, excite, emote, which just is a reminder that you're writing for an audience and that they might get bored. Even examiners get bored. I can tell you, as an examiner, I get bored. It's amazing how much I have to read other stuff, you know, better stuff, dare I say it, while I'm marking papers, because I just get bored of reading things that aren't interesting, and I really love the good answers. I love the answers where students actually tried. So just to repeat, Daft Forest, direct address, alliteration, fact, opinion, rhetorical question, emotive words, statistics, rule of 3 or tripartite sequence. Okay, just to bear in mind that emotive words aren't always emotions. They might well be whole phrases or ideas that are emotive for various reasons, perhaps because they are talking about helpless or vulnerable individuals, such as children, the poor, victims of disaster or victims of crime, victims of abuse, victims of war. Any of those are going to create emotion. Animals as well, particularly cute animals or endangered animals or neglected animals will also create emotion. Don't forget that photographs will be emotive often, and that will be the idea in a charity campaign. Now, the photograph will be designed to tug at your heartstrings, and you'll find connections with emotive phrases in the text. That will also be good for question 2 on section 8. The difference between fact and statistics remains to be seen, I suppose, but statistics should be looking for numbers. You should have a couple of, don't go overboard, but you should have a couple of statistics in your question 6. 70% of, 55% of, 1 in 3, people say that. Remember that 1 in 3 actually sounds more than a third somehow, but say 3 in 10 people also sounds a bit more than 30%. So think about how you're presenting your statistics. Use your mathematical knowledge here. Also, use a bit of common sense. Is it likely that 99% of parents in a school, for example, think their children should not do homework? Highly unlikely, but it may be possible that as many as 19% of parents argue that pupils get too much homework, and that is still a valid statistic. Bear in mind, if you write into head teachers, that they will need to take into account every parent's viewpoint. And just a couple of words on the MASSIVE. Senses, of course, are your 5 senses. Now, what you see is fairly easy, but it's a reminder to use adjectives as well. What you can touch, not so common to use. It's easy to use smell and much forgotten about, so remember smell. And then obviously sound as well, and there's your opportunities for onomatopoeia coming in there as well as alliteration. And finally taste, again a bit neglected, so if in doubt, try to fling something to do with taste into your descriptive piece and something to do with smell and get some sounds in there. Alright, and you'll really start to engage your reader. Interesting verbs, just remember, if you're using a word like walk, don't, alright, go into the exam with a few alternatives for walk. Think about what mood you're in as you're walking, or as the person's walking down the street, and use an appropriate verb, and maybe they're skipping down the street. All right. If you've got, create a bit of curiosity through your verbs. So have someone doing all sorts of flamboyant actions, and then think, well, why? What's happened to? Have they just passed a driving test? Have they just passed their exams? Has someone just proposed to them? What is it that's making them want to be so bouncy? So create interest through your language. Get your reader asking questions. Deliberately craft. That's what's needed for the higher grades. Okay, hope that's useful. It's me signing out for now. If you do want any videos on any particular topics, let me know and I may be able to crank one out for you.